So I'm delighted to have with me Professor Mrta Nusbaum. It's a great pleasure to have you for this important conversation on the role of humanity in the academic world. And I wanted to start by actually something that I've just read recently about legislation in the United States to prohibit discussion of controversial issues in classrooms.
Well, it's not all controversial issues. It's particularly aimed at what they refer to, what the Republicans call critical race theory, but it isn't really just that. It's aimed at all teaching that says that racism is structural and is not just a matter of individual bad behavior. Yeah, I mean, of course, I think this is ridiculous. And it's ridiculous to require teachers to teach something false. We all know that racism is not just a matter of individual bad behavior, neither is sexism. It's ingrained in laws and institutions and in the teaching of police in all kinds of ways. It's part of the structure of society. Now, of course, teachers have freedom of speech. So at some point, I'm sure this will be litigated under the First Amendment, and people will say, well, you're curbing unconstitutionally the free speech of teachers in the classroom. So I'm looking forward to that litigation, but in the meantime, we'll see.
So relying on law is certainly an important thing, but where's the role of education in it? Where can we make a difference by educating people to be more tolerant, more egalitarian? Or did we fail, and now that we failed, we're just turning to the law as our last protector?
No, I think, I mean, as I say, I think law has a backward influence on education in the family, and then, of course, in schools, it should be. Yeah, education is tremendously important, and I think there are really three aspects of it that are very important for the present day. One is that education, a good education, should teach you sound critical thinking. It should be Socratic. It should teach you not to believe some ghastly lie that you read on the internet, but to examine everything and apply the test of evidence and the test of rational argument. We need Socrates now more than ever before, I'm afraid, because social media are so capable of spreading false information. And that has to do with the emotions too, because of course you're not going to go running out after somebody if you've sifted the evidence and you actually don't believe that they've caused you harm. But then the second thing is you need to know history. I find that, I don't know what happens in Israel, but my own country is incredibly ignorant of history. So when people talk about, oh, this is the worst time in the world, I have to point out that when I was a child in the 1950s, actually, African Americans were being lynched in the South. Women were not allowed to go to any of the major universities, and they weren't in law firms or university workplaces. Gays and lesbians were all closeted. So to point out that in history, we actually do gradually, slowly make some progress. And then what are the places where we haven't made enough progress? We need to know that too. And of course, we need to look outside our own country too, because we're in conversation with so many other countries who have problems that perhaps we can assist with. So history is really crucial, and kids don't get enough of it. We had a law called the No Child Left Behind Act in the US, which focused only on math and reading skills. And every school was going to be tested every year in math and reading. And if they didn't progress, then they would have to be penalized and lay off teachers. The result was they stopped hiring history teachers because that wasn't part of the test. Now things have gotten a little bit better, and the new Common Core does have history in it, but history is crucial. But then the third thing that's crucial from the very beginning of a child's education is the development of the imagination. Every human being is born as what psychologist Paul Bloom calls a mind reader. That is, we're capable of entering the position of another human being. And this is an ability that apparently children have as young as 1 year old, but we usually use it very narrowly. Children learn to think what their parents are thinking, think maybe what their playmates are thinking, but they never get encouraged to think what somebody completely different in class or race or gender is thinking. And that we need to train that, because it's like a muscle we all have, but it's usually not exercised very well. And education can do this in many ways, but I think one key way is the role of literature and the arts in education, because of course that's what great literature does. It asks you to occupy many different positions and see the world through many different eyes. It's true of not just literature, but music. I've just been teaching a course on opera, so I want to mention opera. But in any case, there are just so many ways that the arts do this when we're subjected to them in the classroom. But I also want to say participation in the arts is even more critical. For young people, for example, one thing that often happens in classrooms, and I hope it will still happen after these new laws, is that kids are asked to put on a play about, let's say, Rosa Parks, who was the first woman who defied the rule that blacks had to sit in the back of the bus. And a white kid is assigned the role of Rosa Parks, who's told, go to the back of the bus. And so that person, if they're at all sensitive, will develop some of the emotions temporarily of humiliation, of shame that woman had when she was told, go to the back of the bus, but also the emotion of determination, dedication to justice that led her to resist and protest. So these participatory uses of the arts are really, really important, because it gets under your skin. You feel the emotions with your own body as you act out a different role. But there was a new wave of critique which said, oh, the humanities are useless, just a place for left-wing propaganda. And it was really having consequences. Humanities programs were being defunded, and it wasn't just happening, of course, in the US. So this book was less focused on the US, because I saw it happening all over the world, that the humanities were being defunded in favor of things that are thought to be more useful and, as you quite rightly say, less controversial. So I, again, set aside time to write on that topic, and I decided to make it deliberately quite international. So my first part was historical, about the history of humanities education, going back to the 19th century with people like Pestalozzi and Froebel. And of course, I went back even before that to the Greeks, but that's what I always do. But then I focused a lot on Rabindranath Tagore, who's a figure that I enormously admire, great Indian educator who was very influential in the early 20th century. And he taught so many great educators in the West, like Maria Montessori and Leonard Elmhurst. So people don't even realize what a great influence he had all over the world. And I liked talking about Tagore because it reminded my audience that this isn't a place where the West has progressed and the rest has been left behind. Actually, Tagore's school and university in Shantiniketan outside Kolkata was a model for the rest of the world, and it had great influence on the rest of the world. And I still think Tagore is one of the great thinkers about education. I'm teaching a seminar on his work next year. But anyway, as part of my love of India and part of my dedication to our university's cooperation with Indian scholars. But anyway, I did that book in that way. And then I looked closely at these three abilities that I talked about at the beginning of our talk. That is critical thinking in a Socratic way, the development of historical awareness, and the training of the imagination. And I think, I mean, somehow or other, that book has found an audience. It's a short book, and that's always a good recipe for finding an audience, I think. But it's been translated into 25 languages, Yuli. I never imagined that would happen. And when I get a copy of the Sinhalese translation, now in its second printing, I wonder, because who is actually reading it? And it doesn't have, how much does it have to say to the culture of Sri Lanka and its universities? But it has. It's been translated into Vietnamese, Sinhalese, and really pretty much all the European languages. But I'm particularly proud of the Asian and African translations that the book has had, because I think it's very important to say this is a problem for all young people who are aspiring to build a viable democracy. My basic argument was education is not just for a profession where you're going to get a job and make money. That's one good thing that education does. But another crucial thing it does is to train citizens to participate in democratic self-government. So my case was, even if you don't like the humanities, even if you don't want to major in the humanities, all students should have a certain amount of humanities so that they can be decent citizens when they have to vote on measures like the one you mentioned at the beginning of our talk.
So do you think that part of the crisis now of democracy has to do with actually a result of these years where literacy and, imagination and emotions and history were declining in their importance, and the young generations that we now meet in the streets are people who have not acquired these skills? Is that an explanation to what we see all over the world with the decline of democracy or the threatening of democratic regimes?
Well, I think to some extent it was there all along. If I think about the whole idea of liberal arts education, and actually we've still got that in the United States. That is not only in high school, but in university, people have to take a certain number of core courses in philosophy, literature, and so on. There are only 3 countries in the world in which that's the dominant system of education: South Korea, Scotland, I count that as a country, and the United States. In other places, it exists in part, like all the Jesuit universities in Latin America have that system. And in the Netherlands, they've put it in, but you have to pay extra to have that liberal arts program, which I think is much worse than if they didn't put it in at all. And so, wherever you are, there are people trying to do that. But when you have the basic structure, the people go to university to study just one subject, you're already in trouble, because then people have to make these very difficult choices. And it filters back into what they do in high school, because they want to be prepared to do the thing they do in the university. And of course, very few people will choose philosophy if they see it as their future career. Well, they shouldn't. There are not that many jobs in philosophy, but it's for a completely different purpose. It's for forming all students, whether they're going to be engineers or whether they're going to be doctors. Increasingly, by the way, medical schools are seeing the need for more humanities. And our medical school has a whole medicine and humanities program. And the idea is to make physicians more imaginative and more compassionate, which is badly needed. So anyway, we all need to have that. But the system makes it very difficult. So in India, for example, where the thing that every parent wants the kid to get into is the Institutes of Technology and Management, those were technical from the very beginning. They had very little humanities. And even before that, people wanted to get high scores on the entrance exams, so they focused on that, and the schools themselves didn't have humanities. Different states were different. So the state that Prime Minister Modi comes from, Gujarat, had required education that taught gross historical falsehoods, namely that Hitler was a hero who did excellent things for his people. If you're a kid in Gujarat schools, that's what you learn, despite many international and national protests against that. But anyway, all the schools were alike in that they were too narrow. So then when they get to the Institute of Technology and Management, we once had a conference, a bi-national conference on affirmative action. What happens when you get there and you find that you've got people who were admitted by special quotas for minorities, namely the lower castes, and other set-asides. Well, they don't actually have them for Muslims, they should, but in any case, that was one of the things we talked about in our book. But when they see these people from the lower castes who get in with a different test score, because there is an affirmative attempt to give them an extra opportunity, they right away, they don't know how to handle this because their imagination has not been trained. They've been brought up thinking these people are beneath you. And the instructors report that there's bullying, people refuse to cooperate with them on projects. And there was one instructor in IIT Mumbai who decided all by himself to put in a humanities curriculum to deal with this imagination gap. So he thought maybe we can actually get people to see the point of view of a Dalit who's trying to enter the Institute of Technology and Management. But of course, by that time, by age 18, it's not very easy to teach that. So it should have begun much earlier. Anyway, the structure makes it very hard because they're given the signal from early years. What you're there for is to be a good techie person and get a good tech job, and then you have all the skills for that. But the fact that you don't have the skills of citizenship, that's not noticed. Now, I do think that has a lot to do with the decline of India's democracy. In the early days, Yuli, it was such a wonderful group of people, and they were from all castes, but they all agreed in cultivating the imagination. I'm a great fan of B.R. Ambedkar, who wrote the Indian Constitution, the great legal mind of the 20th century, I would say. He just luckily, he had a very good education because his father worked for the British Army. Now, the British Army had many prejudices, but one thing they did not have was caste prejudice. So they promoted his father, and the father was able to give his children an excellent private education. So he got this education, and then later he went to Columbia and got an economics degree and a law degree and so on. But, you know, those were the people who founded the nation, and they were full of the imagination of difference. If you read the debates in the Constituent Assembly, it's just so wonderful, the things that they're able to see and say. But then they didn't provide for the next generation. And I'm afraid that was in part the fault of Nehru and Ambedkar. They actually believed, and it was so silly of them, that the future of India depended on economic growth and economic prosperity. And Nehru loved the humanities. The night before he died, he had a book of poetry open on his bedside table. Robert Frost, he was reading. But he thought that was just his particular preference. And he didn't think the nation needed that. And so they didn't invest in that for the rest of the nation. The schools were going to emphasize tech learning and all the things that were needed to produce short-term economic growth. And of course, it was very boring too, because it was taught by people who didn't involve the students in Socratic questioning. To this very day, education in government schools in India is incredibly boring. And that gave the Hindu right an opening. They had very exciting after-school groups that taught you all the things about Hindu pride that are really destroying India today. But they played games with kids, and they got them to run around and say, India first, and let the nation rule, and so on. So they trained a generation falsely, partly because the schools themselves were not training them truly. And now here we are, where Modi is tremendously popular. It's really on the verge of not being a democracy at all now. So I think, you know, that each country has its own story, but I think that's all too common, that not really thinking about the humanities leads down the road to a decline of the public culture, of public imagination.
So what do you think can bring the humanities back into the center of our academic studies? And in schools, you know, they are sort of becoming less and less important in schools, and obviously less and less important in the universities, both in the United States, in Israel, everywhere. So how can we bring them back and make young people realize it's important for them to acquire these skills?
Well, I'll tell you how it happened in our university, which was a great deal of top-down emphasis on teaching in the core curriculum. A lot of big shot people don't want to teach entry-level undergraduates, and they try to avoid that. What's happened at Stanford, for example, is no one wants to do that. You don't get any promotion credit for teaching. And so they fobbed it off onto a group of postdocs. And the students don't respect the postdocs. They think, oh, well, these are part-timers and they're not big shots. Whereas what Zimmer, our president, did was to insist every single member of a humanities department has to teach in the core. I'm exempt because I'm paid 100% by the law school. So that's a different story, but I teach undergraduates anyway, but not in the core. But Zimmer said, you know, you don't do that, then you don't get any new appointments, period. I was once at a conference of deans of all the universities in the Midwest, And I came in late after Zimmer had given his talk, and I started giving my talk about Socratic criticism and how important it was. And so one of the deans said, well, we hear from you how important Socratic criticism is, but we've heard from your president about how important top-down insistence on certain definite requirements is. How would you put these together? But I had an answer because I knew what Zimmer had done, and he had revived the humanities at the University of Chicago because he made everyone do it. And therefore people are, they care about doing it and they do it well. Our philosophy department has now become so popular that we have more majors than history and more majors than English, which is very unusual for a very small department. But people teach really, really well. My colleague Agnes Kaller doesn't just teach her own classes, she does a thing at night because she decided undergraduates like to talk at night. So she has this group called Night Owls where people gather in a student hall and they have food and drink. And then, you can't have alcohol drink because the drinking age is 21, but they have some sort of drink. And she gets a controversial guest, and then she has a debate with the guest. One time it was her own ex-husband and they were talking about divorce. So it's a cool topic and a cool conversation, and the students love it. She usually gets 200, 250 people, and it's not for credit, it's just, so to make it fashionable, you must have really good teaching. And that's what I think we've learned to have. In graduate school, all our graduate students get coached in being good teachers, and they get plenty of chances to do that too. So I think that's the first thing.
So let's hope, I think the world is changing, education is changing. So let's hope one of the things that will be the focus of our rethinking education would be the role of humanities, and we will place more emphasis on that. And consequently, we will get, more influence on our future citizens.
I hope so. I really, really hope so. And of course, it has to be done with very careful protections for the freedom of speech of professors. I know there was a bill that was introduced a few years back that would have limited the ability to teach controversial subjects. My friend Abner de Shalit had quite a conversation with the minister at that point. And so, we have to be careful of any attempt to limit the freedom of speech in the classroom. So that, of course, you have to be very watchful about. But to hope that philosophy, just because it teaches rigorous argument about difficult topics, will be seen increasingly as something that helps a nation make progress beyond the very difficult problems. With part of my money from a prize that I won a few years ago, I endowed a series of what are now called Nusbaum lunches at our law school, which are, if you want to get students to listen to a different point of view, it's very hard to get them into a class because they think, oh, Nussbaum's on the left, I won't take her class, or so-and-so else is on the right, I won't take their class. So to get them in, you have to make it something else, not a class. And so we have these 90-minute lunchtime sessions where there are two professors that have contrasting views on a topic and 15 students who also have contrasting views on the topic. And we have general rules of civility, but otherwise we want to differ and we want to do a little bit of reading, but mostly talking. And people really enjoy this greatly. There's a demand to have more and more of them. And so you've got to put some more money in. But anyway, it does help, I think, on very controversial topics. I've dealt with, for example, the whole question of whether weddings can refuse to have a wedding cake for a lesbian and gay couple. And, in the course of 90 minutes, people actually converged on a kind of consensus compromise position. Doesn't always happen that way, but at least people understand much more clearly what the differences are, and they have respect for the people on the other side. And of course, it's not just about that sort of topic. That happens to be what I do, but there are things that talk about the internet and net neutrality, all the controversial topics of the day. Some group of professors can do a Nussbaum lunch on that. So I think we need more sessions like that so that the politicians understand you shouldn't be afraid of philosophical dialogue. It actually helps you make progress toward consensus on some of the most difficult issues.
So thank you very much. I think was a very
I guess
optimistic ending. I hope we can convince, you know, a growing audience to discuss philosophy and enjoy it.
Yeah,
and
I think
learn
so.
from it.
Because it's a lot of fun. It really is so much fun.